Some secrets don't stay buried. They wait in the dark corners of history, patient as stone, until the right person stumbles across them. For Lieutenant Commander Rebecca Winters, that moment came on a Tuesday afternoon. She was in her grandfather's old apartment, surrounded by the remnants of a life being packed away into boxes. Inside his military footlocker, beneath a false bottom, she found it. A leather journal, cracked with age, smelling of dust and something else. Something faintly chemical she couldn't quite place. Her grandfather, Colonel David Winters, had died 3 weeks earlier at 92. His mind was sharp to the end, but his lungs had failed him. The doctors called it pulmonary fibrosis, a cruel, unexplained hardening that turned every breath into a struggle. But this journal, she would soon learn, told a very different story. Rebecca sat on the floor and opened it. The handwriting was precise, military-trained. The first entry dated October 14, 1971, and it began with 4 words that shattered everything she thought she knew about her. Grandfather's career at NASA. Vanguard 7 has returned. Vanguard 7? The name meant nothing to her. As an officer in the Space Operations Division at Johnson Space Center, Rebecca had access to almost every historical mission record. She'd spent years studying the archives, memorizing the names of missions and astronauts. But Vanguard 7 was nowhere in the databases. It was a ghost. She kept reading, her heart starting to beat a little faster. A capsule came down 200 miles west of our projected coordinates. We reached it at dawn. 6 crew members went to Venus. 6 came back. But something else came with them. Something that doesn't belong in our atmosphere. The entry continued, describing the immediate aftermath. Major Frank Holloway won't stop screaming about the air being wrong. Says it tastes different. Says it's watching him breathe. Rebecca's hands trembled as she turned the page. Her grandfather had been part of the recovery teams in the 70s, pulling heroes from the ocean after splashdown. He'd told her stories of Cold War tensions and the thrilling race for the stars. But he never, not once, mentioned Vanguard 7. The next entry was dated 2 days later. Holloway died this morning. Autopsy shows every symptom of vacuum exposure. Burst blood vessels, nitrogen bubbles in the tissue, hemorrhaging in the eyes and brain. But the capsule was pressurized. The seals were intact. He died surrounded by breathable air, and his body doesn't understand why. Rebecca stood up, her legs stiff, and walked to the window. The Houston skyline glittered under the afternoon sun. Somewhere out there was Johnson Space Center, the heart of America's space exploration, its archives supposedly holding every detail. Yet her own grandfather had worked on a mission to Venus that had been completely erased from history. She returned to the journal, flipping through pages filled with technical jargon, atmospheric readings, and increasingly desperate notes about the other crew members. They were all dying, one by one, in the same impossible way. Autopsies all showed the same contradiction. Death by asphyxiation in rooms full of perfectly good oxygen. Then an entry from late October made her blood run cold. We opened the capsule today. Dr. Patricia Vance insisted, despite the quarantine protocols. She said we needed to understand what they brought back. The interior was empty. No biological samples. No rock specimens. No data cores. Just 6 dead astronauts and a smell like copper and ozone. But the air inside? The air read at 89% nitrogen, 2% oxygen. The exact atmospheric composition of Venus in a sealed capsule that had been closed on Earth for 3 weeks. Rebecca grabbed her phone. She searched for news from that period, NASA missions, astronaut deaths, anything. Nothing matched. She searched for the crew names her grandfather had listed. Frank Holloway, Patricia Vance. Names that should have been legendary. But the internet returned nothing. Just random people with the same names in different professions. It was as if they had never existed. Her phone buzzed. A text from her colleague, Lieutenant Garrett Bishop. Need you back at JSC. Atmospheric anomaly in Building 31. Third one this month. Rebecca stared at the message, then back at the journal. Her grandfather's final entries from years later described the exact same thing. Localized atmospheric anomalies around Johnson Space Center. Pockets of air where the oxygen would just vanish for exactly 47 seconds, then return as if nothing had happened. He'd been tracking them for decades, watching the frequency increase, trying to warn people. The last entry was dated just 5 days before his death. It's not hunting randomly anymore. It knows who was there, who saw what came back. Fletcher died last week. Same lone failure. Morrison's daughter is having the dreams now. The suffocation dreams where you gasp in rooms full of air that your body refuses to process. It's expanding beyond the original witnesses. It's looking for anyone who might remember. Anyone who might tell the truth. And then, a direct message to her. Rebecca, if you're reading this, burn these pages. Forget you ever saw the name Vanguard 7. The thing they brought back from Venus is undone yet. It's patient. It's methodical. And it's still here, hiding in our atmosphere, turning our own air against us. But then, the tone shifted. But I know you, granddaughter. You won't burn this. You'll do what I trained you to do. You'll investigate. So remember this. The structure they found on Venus wasn't abandoned. It was waiting. And whatever operates it has been studying us for 53 years, learning how we breathe, how we die, and how to make one look like the other. The journal ended there. Rebecca closed it, her mind reeling. The unexplained respiratory failures at JSC, the bizarre readings on the atmospheric monitors, the internal warnings about older buildings where staff felt suddenly breathless. It all clicked into place. She looked at her phone again. Garrett was waiting. Building 31. That was one of the original structures from the Apollo era. It was the same building her grandfather would have worked in during the Vanguard 7 recovery. Rebecca made a decision. She wouldn't burn the journal. She would photograph every single page, upload it to a secure cloud, and then she would go straight to Building 31. If her grandfather was right, if something from Venus had been hiding on Earth for over 50 years, a sudden increase in anomalies meant it was getting more active. Something was about to happen. She grabbed her keys and the journal. As she walked out the door, she couldn't shake the memory of her grandfather's last days. The desperate struggle for each breath, the terror in his eyes as he looked at her and whispered, "It knows about you now." Outside, the Houston air felt thick, heavy, pressing against her skin like something alive. She had breathed this air her whole life, never giving it a second thought. But now, walking to her car with her grandfather's impossible secret under her arm, Rebecca Winters had to wonder if the very atmosphere had become the enemy. And if 6 astronauts had died bringing that enemy home, who would have to die to send it back? Thanks for watching. If you want to find out what happens to Rebecca and the secret of Vanguard 7, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss the next part of this story. Rebecca arrived at Johnson Space Center just as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of orange and red that reminded her uncomfortably of Venus. The security guard waved her through with barely a glance, too focused on his phone to notice the tension in her shoulders, or the way her hand kept drifting to the journal, now locked in her bag. Building 31 stood at the north end of the complex, a relic from the glory days of the space race. Its concrete walls had witnessed every major mission from Apollo to the present. And according to her grandfather's notes, it had also witnessed something that official history refused to acknowledge. She found Garrett waiting outside the entrance. His usually calm expression was gone, replaced by something that looked like barely controlled panic. "Thank God you're here," he said, running a hand through his dark hair. "The readings are getting worse. We've had 4 separate incidents in the last 2 hours." "What kind of incidents?" Rebecca asked, her voice steady despite the unease creeping up her spine. Garrett pulled out a tablet, his fingers swiping through graphs that showed atmospheric composition over time. Look at this. At 1432, the oxygen level in room 214 dropped from 21% to 0.8% in under 10 seconds. It stayed there for 47 seconds exactly, and returned to normal. No equipment malfunction. No ventilation issues. The air just changed. 47 seconds. The same duration her grandfather had documented. Rebecca felt something cold settle in her stomach. Was anyone in the room? That's the thing. Garrett's voice dropped lower. Yeah, a maintenance worker named Carlos Fuentes. He collapsed, couldn't breathe, started turning blue. But here's what doesn't make sense. We had 3 other people rush in to help him, and they could breathe fine. They dragged him out into the hallway, and he immediately recovered. Like flipping a switch, it was targeting him specifically. The words came out before Rebecca could stop them. Garrett looked at her strangely. What do you mean targeting? It's an atmospheric anomaly, not a predator. Rebecca opened her mouth to explain, then caught herself. How could she tell him about Vanguard 7 without sounding completely insane? How could she explain that something from another planet had been selectively hunting people for over 50 years? She decided to change tactics. Has Fuentes worked here long? Actually, no. He's only been with us for 6 months. Before that, he worked private sector. But his father used to work here back in the 70s. Retired in '89. The cold in Rebecca's stomach turned to ice. I need to talk to Fuentes. Now. They found Carlos in the medical bay, sitting on an examination table while a nurse checked his vitals. He was in his early 30s, with the broad shoulders of someone who worked with his hands and the haunted eyes of someone who just brushed against death. When he saw Rebecca's uniform, he straightened up automatically. Sir, I don't know what happened. 1 second I was fine, the next I couldn't breathe. It felt like the air just disappeared. Rebecca pulled up a chair, keeping her voice gentle. Carlos, I need to ask you something that might sound strange. Did your father ever mention a mission called Vanguard 7? The color drained from Carlos's face so quickly that the nurse took a step forward, alarmed. His hands started shaking. How do you know about that? My grandfather was part of a recovery team. He left me his notes. Carlos looked at Garrett, then back at Rebecca, making some internal calculation about trust. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. My father was one of the technicians who processed the capsule after they brought it in. He never talked about it, not for 40 years. Then last year, when the cancer got bad, he started having nightmares. Dreams where he was suffocating even though the hospital room was full of oxygen. Right before he died, he made me promise. He made me promise that I'd never set foot in Building 31. But you're here, Rebecca stated gently. I needed the job. I thought he was just delirious from the medication, you know, talking nonsense about missions that didn't exist, and air that wasn't really air. Carlos's voice cracked. But today, when I couldn't breathe, I understood. Something's wrong with this building. Something's been wrong with it since 1971. Rebecca glanced at Garrett, whose expression had shifted from skepticism to disturbed attention. She made a decision. Garrett, I need to show you both something, but it has to stay between us for now. In an empty conference room, Rebecca spread out photographs of her grandfather's journal entries across the table. She watched as both men read through the accounts of the Vanguard 7 recovery, the impossible deaths, the atmospheric anomalies that had plagued Johnson Space Center for decades. Garrett's face grew increasingly pale, while Carlos nodded along as if pieces of a horrible puzzle were finally clicking into place. This is impossible, Garrett said, but his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself more than them. A manned mission to Venus in 1971? We didn't have the technology. The Soviets sent probes, but they lasted less than an hour on the surface. How could we have sent humans? Maybe we didn't send them to the surface, Rebecca said, pulling up a specific page. Look at this entry. My grandfather mentions that the crew reported finding a structure in Venus's upper atmosphere. Something massive, something artificial. What if Vanguard 7 wasn't meant to land? What if it was meant to investigate something we'd already detected in orbit? Carlos leaned forward, his finger pointing to a sketch in the margins. It showed something that looked like a geometric lattice, impossibly complex, just hanging in space. Beneath it, in her grandfather's careful handwriting, were 5 words. They went inside. That was the mistake. What does that mean? Garrett asked, his voice strained. It means, Rebecca said slowly, working through the implications as she spoke, that whatever they found wasn't just a structure. It was functional. And when they entered it, something came back with them. Something that can manipulate atmospheric composition. Something that's been hiding here, studying us, for 53 years. As if on cue, the lights in the conference room flickered once. All 3 of them looked up at the ceiling, their conversation suddenly suspended in a moment of primitive fear. The ventilation system hummed its normal rhythm, but the air felt different now. Thicker, more aware. Garrett cleared his throat, breaking the silence. According to the building records, there are 17 rooms in Building 31 that have experienced multiple atmospheric anomalies over the years. Room 214, where Carlos was attacked, is one of them. But there's another room that's had more incidents than all the others combined. Where? Rebecca demanded. Sub-basement level. Storage room 003. It has been sealed since 1989. Garrett pulled up a floor plan on his tablet. According to the maintenance logs, it contains archived materials from various missions in the 70s. But here's the interesting part. There's a note in the system saying the room requires special clearance to access. Not just high-level clearance. A specific clearance code that doesn't appear anywhere else in our entire database. Rebecca felt her pulse quicken. That's where they stored the capsule. Or what was left of it, Carlos added grimly. My father mentioned that they'd dismantled parts of it for study. Said the metal had properties they couldn't explain. It was lighter than aluminum, but stronger than titanium, and it held temperature in ways that violated thermodynamic principles. We need to get into that room, Rebecca said, her voice firm. Garrett shook his head. Even if we had the clearance code, which we don't, going down there could be dangerous. If the anomalies are concentrated in that area, then that's where we'll find answers. Rebecca gathered the photographs, her mind made up. My grandfather spent 30 years tracking these incidents, trying to understand the pattern. He died trying to warn people. I'm not going to let that be for nothing. There might be another way. Carlos stood up, pacing to the window. Outside, the campus lights were beginning to flicker on against the gathering darkness. My father left me something besides warnings. He left me a key. An actual physical key, old-fashioned, with a number stamped on it. 3. The room went quiet. Rebecca could hear her own heartbeat, feel the weight of the decision pressing down on all of them. They were standing at a threshold, about to cross from speculation into action, from safety into danger. Once they opened that door in the sub-basement, there would be no pretending ignorance, no claiming they didn't know. When? Garrett asked simply. Tonight, Rebecca said. After the building clears. Fewer people around means fewer potential casualties if something goes wrong. You mean when something goes wrong, Carlos corrected, but he was already reaching for his phone. I'll get the key from my apartment. Meet back here at midnight? They agreed, each of them understanding that they were probably making a terrible mistake, but completely unable to walk away from it. Some truths demanded to be uncovered, no matter the cost. As Rebecca left the conference room, she checked her phone and found a missed call from an unknown number. No voicemail, but there was a text message. It read, "Stop looking. They're watching now. It knows you know." She deleted the message. But the words stayed with her, echoing in her mind as she walked through the quiet corridors of Building 31. Somewhere in the sub-basement, pieces of Vanguard 7 waited in darkness. And if her grandfather was right, they weren't just pieces of metal and wire. They were contaminated, infected, changed by something that had been waiting in Venus's atmosphere for perhaps millions of years, patient and hungry, until 6 human astronauts had finally arrived to carry it home. Thank you for watching. If you want to find out what happens next, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We'll see you in the next one. Midnight. The Houston sky was a dark, starless canvas above Building 31. Rebecca stood in the parking lot, watching the last security patrol complete its rounds. The air was thick, heavy with unspoken history. For the third time in as many minutes, she checked her watch. A voice in her head screamed at her to just get in her car and drive away, to leave the secrets of the past buried where they belonged. But then her grandfather's face would flash in her mind. She saw him in his final days, each breath a losing battle. He had died trying to shield her from this very truth, yet paradoxically, he was also the one who left her the clues to find it. That contradiction was all the proof she needed. This was important. Garrett arrived first, his duffel bag clinking with the tools of their forbidden trade. Atmospheric sensors, emergency oxygen, and a camera, he announced. If we're going down there, I want to document everything. A few minutes later, Carlos pulled up. He sat in his car for a long, tense moment before finally emerging. His knuckles were white from gripping the steering wheel. In his hand, he held a small brass key. It caught the amber streetlight, seeming to glow with a significance that far outweighed its size. My father held this key for 40 years and never used it, Carlos said, his voice barely a whisper. He told me he swore he'd never go back into that room, but he couldn't throw it away. Some part of him knew that eventually someone would have to finish what they started. Using Rebecca's old security code, they slipped through a side entrance. At night, the familiar building felt alien. The long, empty corridors seemed to watch them, their footsteps echoing on floors that had witnessed decades of scientific triumph, but now guarded mysteries that history refused to acknowledge. The elevator ride down to the sub-basement was a chorus of groans and creaks, as if the building itself was trying to warn them away. When the doors shuttered open, they stepped into a hallway lined with old storage rooms. Rust bloomed around the hinges, and the fluorescent lights above flickered, fighting a losing battle against the shadows. Room 003 is at the end, Garrett said, his eyes on a building schematic displayed on his tablet. It's the largest storage space on this level. Takes up almost a quarter of the sub-basement. They walked in silence, the weight of their purpose pressing down on them. The air tasted stale, recycled, and old, but there was something else underneath it. An unfamiliar quality that made Rebecca's lungs work just a little harder, as if her body sensed a threat her mind hadn't yet grasped. The door to room 003 was different. It was heavier, reinforced with steel plating that seemed like overkill for a simple storage area. A faded biohazard symbol was painted on its surface, a relic from decades past. Below it, stenciled in red, were the words, "Authorized personnel only. Atmospheric hazard." Carlos stepped forward with the key. His hand trembled slightly as he slid it into the lock. It turned with a smooth, well-oiled precision, the click of the bolt disengaging echoing loud in the quiet hall. "Wait," Rebecca said, her phone in her hand. "Before we open this, I need to send my grandfather's journal to someone. Someone outside of NASA. Someone who can make sure this information doesn't disappear if something happens to us." Garrett looked at her, his expression serious. "You think it's that dangerous?" She met his gaze. "I think my grandfather watched 7 people die over decades, all from the same impossible cause. Whatever is in this room has been patient for 53 years. I don't want that patience to be rewarded with more silence." She quickly typed an email to her old MIT professor, attaching photos of every journal page and a brief explanation. If they didn't hear from her in 24 hours, the professor was to release everything to the public. It wasn't a perfect safety net, but it was something. "Okay," Rebecca said, giving Carlos a nod. "Open it." The heavy door swung inward with a faint whisper, revealing a darkness so absolute it felt like it was swallowing the beams of their flashlights. Garrett activated his atmospheric sensors. The small screen lit up. Oxygen at 21%. Nitrogen at 78%. Everything's normal so far. He took a tentative step inside, his light sweeping across the room's interior. And then, all three of them froze. The capsule wasn't just stored here, it was displayed. It sat on a raised platform in the very center of the room, like a sacred relic in a shrine, or a warning. Its metallic skin gleamed, impossibly pristine after decades in storage, hinting at materials far beyond human engineering. But it was the walls that truly stunned them into silence. Every single surface was covered in writing. Equations, diagrams, and desperate warnings were scrawled in different handwritings, using different colored pens and markers. It was a chaotic tapestry of obsession, left by people who knew the danger but couldn't stay away. Amid the chaos, Rebecca recognized her grandfather's precise script, his notes a desperate attempt to impose order on madness. "The air is watching," read one message in huge letters across the north wall. "It learns how we breathe." Another warned, "Fletcher died here." Morrison lasted 3 days longer. "It's getting faster." But Rebecca's attention was drawn to a diagram that dominated the eastern wall. Someone had sketched the bizarre structure the Vanguard 7 crew had discovered in the Venusian atmosphere, but with far more detail than her grandfather's journal provided. It wasn't just a lattice. It was a machine of impossible complexity. And at its center, someone had drawn something that looked disturbingly organic. Tendrils, like roots or veins, spread through the perfect geometric patterns. The notation beside it read, "Atmospheric entity, not biological, not mechanical. Something that exists as patterns in gas molecules. It doesn't breathe. It is breath." Suddenly, Garrett's sensor began to beep frantically. "Oxygen is dropping. 18%, 15, 12%. Rebecca felt it then. The change in the air. It wasn't a lack of oxygen. It was a presence. Something vast and ancient was turning its attention toward them, like a great whale noticing the tiny fish swimming near its eye. The pressure didn't change. The temperature held steady, but her lungs fought for every breath, struggling to extract oxygen that the instruments swore was still there. "It's here," Carlos gasped, his voice tight with rising panic. "This is what my father felt. The air is still here, but it's not ours anymore." Rebecca's vision tunneled, darkness creeping in from the edges. She finally understood her grandfather's cryptic notes. The entity didn't remove the oxygen. It changed what oxygen meant. It rewrote the fundamental rules of respiration, making the very air unbreathable, turning breath into a distant memory. "The capsule," Garrett wheezed, pointing with a shaking hand. "Look at the capsule." The metal was moving. Not physically, but the light reflecting from its surface was flowing in mesmerizing, sickening patterns. Spirals and waves that suggested a consciousness, an intention, a hunger. The astronauts had brought this thing back from Venus, carried inside their lungs, in their blood, in the very air of that alien structure. And when they died, the entity had remained, patient, learning, spreading through Johnson Space Center's ventilation systems like a slow, invisible poison. Rebecca's knees buckled, her body screaming for oxygen that was all around her yet impossibly out of reach. Through her dimming vision, she saw Carlos crawling for the door. Garrett collapsed by his equipment, the walls covered in the last words of dead men who had tried and failed to stop this. But then she saw something else. In her grandfather's handwriting, partially obscured by a later scrawl, was a single sentence she hadn't seen in his journal. It responds to carbon dioxide. Exhale at it. Confuse it. Make it forget how to hunt. With the last shred of her conscious control, Rebecca forced herself to breathe out. Not a shallow gasp of panic, but a long, deep, deliberate exhalation aimed directly at the capsule. Carbon dioxide, the waste product of life. The one thing the entity would never expect. The patterns on the capsule's surface stuttered. They hesitated. And in that single moment of confusion, the oxygen returned. All three of them gasped, drawing in air like drowning victims breaking the surface. Garrett's sensors stabilized, but Rebecca knew. The entity was still there, watching, learning, analyzing this new variable before it attacked again. Out, she croaked. Now. They stumbled back into the hallway, slamming the heavy door shut. Carlos fumbled with the key, his hands shaking as he locked the deadbolt. The relief of breathable air was overwhelming, but a deeper, more chilling truth settled into Rebecca's bones. The entity wasn't trapped in that room. It never had been. The capsule was just ground zero. The anomalies, the strange atmospheric events, recorded all over the facility for years. That was the entity's real body, spread across time and space, patiently learning the rules of its new home. They had come here seeking answers, and they had found them. But those answers only created a far more terrifying question. If this entity had been studying humanity for 53 years, learning how we breathe, how we die, how we investigate, what was it planning to do with all that knowledge? As if on cue, her phone buzzed. With trembling hands, she pulled it out. A new message was on the screen. It read, "Good. Now you understand?" The message was from her grandfather's old work number, a line that had been disconnected 3 years ago.